Today's video is related to the previous one, the one about public speaking. We agreed to encourage our students to provide their feedback to each other, but what kind of feedback should they provide and what are the characteristics of constructive feedback? Hello dear colleagues, this is Sana Lamtara. If you want to answer these questions, keep watching this video till the end. I share very interesting tips and strategies. First, it's really important to examine these two dichotomies, constructive versus destructive feedback. Constructive feedback is a technique to inform the doers of the actions what exactly they can do to perform even better. On the other hand, destructive feedback, as its name suggests, destructs rather than constructs. For example, when you tell students, employees they did or are doing a terrible job, I'm sure you're now thinking about those situations when somebody, be it a teacher or an employer, provided you with destructive feedback. And of course, we all understand how much it hurts. And let's be honest, dear colleagues, let's also reflect upon our practices, our behaviors, what we say and how we say it. Not only in our professional practices, but also in our personal life. So it's very important to identify constructive feedback as an effective communication tool. Communication, which I referred to in the previous videos as a soft skill. Well, at some point in our professional life, we will certainly need to give or receive feedback, which is very important for our professional growth. So feedback provides recipient with new insights, perspective, suggestions, which contribute to the following outcomes. Thanks to constructive feedback, employees gain new perspectives on how they should behave and what exactly leads to better performances and outcomes. Then, the key to successful business is making employees feel valued and useful by reminding them constantly that they do matter to the company and that they do contribute widely to the success of the company. And this increases employees' engagement. So thanks to constructive feedback, employees are very likely to be committed in the workplace and they can even push the business to a higher level. When employees are able to exchange and receive constructive feedback, there is room for more communication channels, which helps in resolving conflict before it becomes worse. And this, of course, strengthens work and relationships. As for the importance of constructive feedback for personal development, the power of feedback cannot be denied as it is the starting point towards the understanding of our own performances, our own actions, our own strengths and weaknesses. Well, I don't like this word weaknesses. Let's say areas that still need to be improved. So feedback helps people gain self-awareness in addition to an understanding of how they are perceived by people and what kind of actions or words they trigger in others. Feedback also improves morale and reduces confusion regarding what others expect from us. As a result, we're provided with more guidance in terms of how we can express ourselves so that we can have a significant impact on others. Now, what about referring to feedback as a dichotomous variable with two distinct characteristics, positive and negative? In a research study, the relationships between positive normative feedback, self-efficacy, performance, and flow experience are investigated, and the results provide experimental evidence that positive feedback enhances self-efficacy. And it goes without saying that the opposite is also true, which means that negative feedback diminishes self-efficacy. In order to avoid any misconceptions, I went through a number of studies in order to understand this phenomenon in the literature, and I can say that the most persuasive view is that negative feedback impacts intrinsic motivation negatively. There are also some studies which claim that negative feedback can trigger feelings of intrinsic motivation to improve quality of work or performances. But in my opinion, positive, constructive feedback takes primacy over negative feedback, and even for those who believe that negative feedback has positive outcomes, to those I'm saying, the kind of feedback you give tells much about who you are as a person, and your negative feedback reveals a lot about your communication skills and your ability to deal effectively, to communicate effectively with people around you. I personally think that negative feedback is inhibiting, and it sometimes takes a very long time to recover from negative feedback. What about you? Do you agree with me? Please share your comments below. I would love to read about your experiences and views. And now, dear colleagues, dear 21st century educators, let's get rid of that negative feedback and reinforce a constructive feedback culture in our classes to build healthy individuals and a healthy society, I believe. Let me stick to the same public speaking activity dealt with in the previous video, and let's agree that you're going to train your students on how to give constructive feedback away before students deliver their speeches. So here are a number of tips. So don't use you statements while giving constructive feedback, because when you already start with you, then we do understand that you're placing blame on the receiver, who is very likely to feel belittled and blamed. Something else which reinforces blame is the why statements, continually asking why something has been done. Why did you do that? How could you possibly have done that? Why did you focus on this and not that? Well, these types of statements harm more than they help. They do confuse, and most, if not all, students get enraged. The third tip, angry tone, plays a tremendous role while giving feedback. So it's really a good idea to stay calm while giving feedback, and then you stay away from an angry, irritated tone to give a good impression of yourself and to make people feel comfortable, especially feedback receivers. Tip number 4 concerns lack of suggestions. So when you keep criticizing without giving suggestions or directions as where to go next or what to do instead, then your feedback is just destructive and you're not pushing your classmates towards a higher level. Tip number 5, sometimes feedback is all negative, and I think it's always a good idea to start with thank you words to set a positive atmosphere. Then you identify the positive aspects before moving to areas which need improvement. Tip number 6, constructive feedback shouldn't lack support. As a teacher, students should be encouraged to provide support to each other through appreciation. Remember the previous video. So as human beings, when we feel supported, we are more open to feedback and we can learn from it. Tip number 7 advises us to focus on the behavior rather than the individual. So constructive feedback should be about the content, the speech, the work itself rather than the individual. An example, you want to address the speaker's tone of voice. Well, it just seems harsh to say, you speak too slowly, or I couldn't even hear what you were talking about. Instead, you can say, the tone of voice could have been more motivating to suit the nice story you were talking about. Or you provided a very convincing argument and you could have presented them with a more persuasive tone. Doesn't it seem better? It does. In addition to those interesting tips, I suggest you provide your students with a set of expressions they can use to give constructive feedback. Expressions like the following: it was a good start, or it was a good introduction, maybe you could. Thanks for that idea, and how about? I love your suggestion, and I can add another one to make your presentation even richer. The aspects you mentioned are really interesting. If I were you, I would. So conditional to is also useful. Dear colleagues, if you can think of other useful expressions, please share them in the description box below. I would love to read them. And now, what about feedback receivers? Those who receive feedback, how should they behave? Well, here are some tips for them as well. Tip number 1. Feedback receivers need to be receptive. They need to listen very carefully, and they need to show it through their facial expressions, their attentive eye contact, their smile, and also nodding their head affirmatively. Tip number 2. Feedback receivers need to control their defensiveness, or you mustn't even be defensive. You need to listen actively to feedback without thinking about formulating your responses. Rather, receive and accept feedback with grace and dignity, and take your time to thank the person for giving you feedback. The following tip advises you to restate what you have just heard, and this is another useful technique you can use to make sure you got the point, and it's also a way to let the other students know that their opinions really matter. Last but not least, seek out more feedback. Students can either do it immediately or they can set a date with their classmates, with their teachers to reevaluate their works and performances. And don't forget, dear colleagues, that an effective way to teach about constructive feedback is to use these tips and these expressions ourselves while giving feedback to our students. Well, students do understand when they are provided with tips and expressions, but they do accept them wholeheartedly and adopt good habits when they are performed by their teachers. So when you treat your students with respect, politeness, good manners and grace, they are very likely to address each other with the same amount of these virtues. Students look up to their teachers. As you already know, teachers are supposed to be role models for their students, and you're already a role model, undoubtedly. So remember, serving you is my job, and it's also my great pleasure, so stay tuned.